Everybody,
Yeah.
I'm gonna get started. This is problem solving, so if you have no problems ever,
Cool.
go somewhere else. My name is Jody Hamilton, and I'm the co-founder, CTO of ZivTech, which is a Drupal development shop in Philadelphia. I've been CTO there for 5 years. Before that, I was a Drupal freelancer. And you want me to yell a little bit? Okay. I'm really a Drupal generalist, so I mainly do development, but I'll do some front end. I'll do server side. I started out as a freelancer, just doing everything, and that was a very good background to kind of keeping that generality and being able to work on all kinds of different projects. And so I realized one of the things that is really what I'm the best at work is solving problems. And that's because I sort of have a way that I approach it. Since my background before coming into Drupal, I was an analytical chemist.
Cool.
So I started thinking about this game, Akinator. It's kind of a fun game on your smartphone, and kids really like it. It's basically like 20 questions, but the way it works is there's a website, but the website's kind of broken. But the smartphone version's pretty good. So you think of a character. So you'll think of you can think of like the Tooth Fairy, or kids are always like Hermione, and then he asks you questions. So he starts off going, is your character real? Is your character a male? Is your character live in the United States? Does your character wear glasses? Does your character have a sister? And within 20 questions, he usually has it figured out. And you can pick really obscure characters, because if he doesn't know it, you tell him the answer at the end. So it's sort of like this hive mind where he learns more and more characters. So he can even get he can start to know the people that you know in there. And I started thinking about this because he, obviously the motif is magical, but there's nothing magical about it, right? So this program actually can take any kind of, figure out any kind of answer just with yes/no questions very quickly. And I think that kind of narrowing down you can apply to problems that you have on your Drupal site. So at first you know there's a problem, you don't know what caused it, but if you can narrow it down enough just through a series of questions, you can find out specifically what it is. But there's some things about Akinator that are really important. One is if you play it with a kid, sometimes they don't answer the questions right. If you don't answer the questions right, or you answered one of them wrong, and you think you answered it right, he can't get the answer, right? Obviously. So, and that's one of the things that really goes wrong when you're trying to solve a problem. You get a bad data point, and then you start to go down the wrong path. And another thing that he does that's smart is he doesn't start off with a very specific question. He doesn't start off saying, does your character have any red spots on his face, right? He starts off trying to cut everything in half. So he starts off with, is your character male or female? Because that cuts it in half. If you ever played the game Guess Who with kids, the kids I like to beat kids in games. So they'll start and they'll go, oh, Guess Who is kind of like you have 20 characters, and then they have 20 characters, and you're trying to guess which ones they picked, and the kids will go, does your character have blue mohawk? And you're like, no. Is your character a boy? You cut it in half, right? Whereas they will just jump to a specific thing. So these are kind of the steps that I like to take when solving a problem, and I like to treat any problem like it's serious. Like, not wait until I figure out that it's a hard bug. Start every single one just as carefully. You don't know at the beginning if it's going to be a hard bug that's going to take you 2 days, or if you're going to figure it out in 5 minutes. But let me go through the steps. I'm going to go through them one at a time after this slide. So, reproducing, scoping, articulating, researching, experimenting, hacking, refining, shipping, and billing. Okay, so start out with reproducing. So anybody who has clients, you get, if the client is the one reporting a bug, the first step is to try to figure out what the hell they're talking about, right? So if you can't reproduce the problem, or if you think you're reproducing the problem, but it's not the same problem that they had, you haven't even gotten started. So one tool that I use is feedback module. That's what that screenshot is on the right. So that's the module that I work on. And I have it integrated with our ticketing system. So basically, it adds like a little feedback button to your site. And then you can set it just so that your clients can pass on problems that they're seeing on the site. So instead of them sending you an email saying, problem, exclamation mark, caps lock, and then that has to become like 5 emails back and forth where you say, which page were you on? Were you logged in? Which browser were you using? And they go, I was on the news page. You're like, do you mean /news, or did you mean a specific article? Can you give me a link? This does a bunch of stuff behind the scenes, so it keeps track of which page they were on, who they were logged in as, when it happened, so you can correlate it with like things in other logs, and what browser and operating system they were on. Because a lot of times that can be the most annoying thing, because you go, well, which browser are you on? And they go, how do I find out? Like, I want to have this conversation. And so this is like customizable. You can it's a fieldable entity. So these are just like fields that I added onto it, right? And then it keeps the rest of the stuff too. So in terms of Akinator, the reproducing step is when you're playing it with a kid and you go, okay, have you thought of your character? And they go, yeah, got it. And then you go, okay, is your character male or female? And they go, I forget who my character is, right? It's very important. Or sometimes they don't even have one, they're just answering the questions, right? It's very important that everybody knows from the beginning what the problem is, right? And you can't just skip this step and just start trying to fix things. Scoping is the next step after you can reproduce the problem, right? So usually you can reproduce the problem. If you can't, you have to stop. There's nothing you can do if you can't reproduce the problem. You have to get more information on how to reproduce it. So scoping is when you try to figure out the scope of the problem, because they originally will report it as, hey, when I went to this page, there was this problem. Well, is that the scope of the problem? Is the problem on this page, or is the problem on every news page? Is the problem on just the news pages, or is the problem on several types of content pages? Is the problem only when you're logged in? So scoping means not just narrowing it down and saying, okay, it's only on this page when you're logged in. It's also broadening it. So sometimes you'll send a project to a developer and you'll say, and the bug that the client reported was that I'm having trouble, I can't add an image to the WYSIWYG when I'm adding a news article. And then the developer works on it, and then they say, okay, it's fixed. You can now add an image when you're adding a news article. And then the client comes back and says, I have another problem. I can't add an image to the WYSIWYG when I add an event. And you go, why didn't the developer try to figure out what the real problem was instead of just literally what the client said? You have to figure out how big this problem is, or how small it is, and don't just do it the way it was worded originally. So when you're scoping and you're trying to narrow things down, some of the questions that you can ask yourself in order to narrow it down: is this just a visual problem? These are just examples of like Akinator style questions that you could try. Can you reproduce your problem in a different browser? Does your problem relate to data? Does your problem interact with caching? Is your problem new? That's important information. Can you reproduce the problem with JavaScript disabled? Can you reproduce the problem in a different theme? Can you reproduce the problem with a different user role on another page, on last week's code base, locally? If you turn off a module, if you turn off aggregation, if you're on the dev version, if you bypass varnish, if you change input formats. This is a really important question. So a lot of times you get so focused on trying to fix the problem, it's like, well, is this actually a problem, or is this client just insane? Which is also a problem. Like, I mean, sometimes, actually a lot of times, what I'll say, if it was that somebody had done something wrong, for example, we were getting like duplicate posts recently, and it turned out that that some people were double clicking the submit button, right? And it's like, yeah, you can try to say like, oh, you guys are doing it wrong. You don't double click submit buttons, but it's a usability problem. So you can rephrase the problem as not you're an idiot, but there's a usability problem here to address, not an actual bug in what the code's doing. Once you have narrowed it down and reproduced it and figured out what they're talking about, it's really important to stop and write down the actual problem as you've rephrased it. If you if you can't figure out how to solve the problem yourself, but you take the time to go through all of those steps and then write down a better description of the problem, that has moved this process forward a lot, right? So if you're like a project manager and you just go back and forth with the client and you figure out how to reproduce it, and then you rephrase the problem in a much better way instead of like, help, problem on the thing, it's like, if you rephrase it as staff user role does not have access to add fields on these pages or whatever, that's going to save the developer a lot of time. So I think it's important to look at each one of these steps as progress that you're making towards the goal, and the way to really make sure that you're making progress is to write it down. If you don't write down what you've found out, you're not really moving it along, and you're also likely to kind of like forget what was going on. When you're one of the problems that people have when they write down, when they re-articulate the problem, is it's not clear if they're describing what the problem is or what it's supposed to be doing. So make sure it's not ambiguous, because I always get things from clients where they're going, when I'm on this page, I can do this, but when I'm on this page, I can't do it. And you're like, well, which one do you want it to do? Can you say which one is one of those desired? Like, don't just ambiguously kind of say the problem and the solution. And the other thing you need to figure out now, before you get all crazy trying to fix the problem, is the time box. So every issue has sort of its worth, how much it's worth to get fixed, right? And you need to figure this out at this point. And the reason is, once you start solving the problem, you're probably pretty OCD, which is why you're like into solving problems on computers. So you're going to have a hard time controlling yourself after this step, right? So set some boundaries now, right? So you shouldn't just throw yourself to get started at a problem and just be like, oh, it'll probably take 5 minutes. Yeah, you don't know how long it's going to take. It's impossible to estimate problem solving. So you have to make a time box, and you don't say, look, give me an hour and I'll fix it. You say, look, give me an hour to look into it. Then I'll tell you where we are at that hour. We might not. We'll have learned something. Okay. Maybe it'll be fixed. Maybe we'll know that we're making progress when we need a couple more hours. Or maybe we'll revisit it after an hour and we'll say, look, how much time is this worth? We could also do this workaround. Maybe we could get rid of this whole feature that has the problem. Maybe the client would rather throw out the entire feature with the problem than to have you spend 25 hours trying to debug it. So on the right is like an example with rephrasing a problem and making it clear what the goal is. This is an amazing piece of technology I wanted people to think about using. The great thing about using paper when you're solving a problem is you can actually write on it while you're looking at your computer. You don't have to like switch screens, so you can always see it and what's on the screen. You can cross things out. You can highlight things. You can make quick little notes. You definitely want to keep notes during the entire process instead of kind of like trying to be a hero about it and being like, well, I can just figure this out. No need for any organization. The next thing you want to do before you really start trying to get in there yourself is to start off with some research. So researching usually means Google. So if you have something that you might be able to search for, like you have some type of string that you might be able to search for. Sometimes you have a problem where you're like, well, I have no idea how to search for this. So that's more challenging at this point. You can also at this point look in your error logs, like DB log or syslog or your PHP error log or your like the console in Chrome to see if there's JavaScript errors, and also like your status page. And at this point, when you're researching things, you want to copy the links that you find. You're not going to read every single issue thread that you find that might be relevant, but at least like copy the links that you find that seem like they might help. And if the problem is in a specific module, go to that module's issue queue and make sure you're looking at all issues, not just active issues, because a lot of times what happens is if the module has a recent bug, it might have been fixed in the dev version, and then the ticket is closed. So you won't realize that you're on the stable version. They consider the bug closed, and now you can't see that there's a fix available. So just make sure you're looking at all of them. And then you're going to finally start experimenting. So this is basically a series of making hypotheses and then proving and disproving them. It's really important at this point that you recognize if you've disproven your hypothesis, that is progress. So make sure you don't say to yourself, oh, it wasn't that, bad idea. Next thing. Write down what it wasn't. Because when you disprove a hypothesis, that moves you forward. That's the whole thing that the Akinator does. He asks questions, you say no. The no's are just as valuable to him as the yeses, right? Either one narrows it down. But you need to, when you're doing these experiments, write down the results of each of them, because you might end up doing so many of them, you're going to forget the results of the ones at the beginning. And you also want to make sure that that you're absolutely sure on these results, because if you get a bad data point, it's going to really mess you up, right? So, for example, you might say, yeah, the problem is not related to this module because I turned it off and I still had the problem. But did you clear the cache after you turned it off? because maybe it really was that module, but you weren't careful enough to make sure that you were absolutely sure about your conclusion. So if you're coming up with conclusions that are sort of like rushed, and you're not being very careful that you've come to the right conclusion, then having that bad data is worse than not having that data, because that's going to send you completely in the wrong direction. And also, when you're doing these experiments, you want to think about, a lot of times I'll write down a bunch of things to try at the beginning. So I'll say, okay, I could try re-indexing the search, putting it on a different version of the module, turning off this other module. I could try clearing the cache, doing it as a different user, right? And then you can write down all those things that you might try, and then think about how long each of those experiments would take, and start off with the faster ones, right? Because one of my experiments was I could re-index the search. Well, it's a big site. It's going to take me half an hour to re-index the search. So let's not start off with that one unless we like really have a big hunch that that's it. Also, make sure that you're not thinking narrowly here, and go really wide in these experiments. For example, a lot of times people are telling me the problem that they're trying to solve, and then you say, well, is that even a problem? Is the thing that you're describing like even a problem that we should be solving? Maybe we should go back and tell them that they should do it this other way. Maybe it's a problem that can be solved with communication, or by like a completely different approach. Maybe you're trying to debug some. I've seen people do this all the time. They're trying to debug something in the code, and you're like, there's a setting for this. There's a setting for like the thing that you're trying to debug. You didn't even look at the settings page yet. You went straight into debugging the code and didn't even like check what the settings were for this thing. So you don't want to like go get all fixated on one thing when there's like a lot of different things that you can try. And during this experimenting part, it's really important to keep going back to the researching part, because the more you experiment, the more you might come up with new things you could Google, and the more you Google, the more you come up with other ways you could experiment. So make sure you kind of keep on switching modes, and don't let yourself like lock in at this point. Finally, when you're getting close to your solution, because you've done a lot of experiments and narrowed it down, you can get a fix. Sometimes the original fix is rough, and you shouldn't take a lot of time when you're first trying to figure out what the problem is, making the fix perfect. Just see if you can get any type of fix. This would mean like you're actually like locally hacking a module maybe, or you've done some kind of like something else gross. So for my example here, it would be like I hacked the diff module, and that eliminated the problem. Okay, that's still a big step forward, because even though you haven't solved the problem the right way, you at least have a solution. And make sure that you keep track of what that solution is, because it's easier to refine a solution than to find one in the first place. Okay, so then after you get the hack, then it's time to start cleaning up. So this is the point where you figure out a responsible solution, right? So this means like if this problem was a regression, meaning this problem already was fixed before, and a similar problem has happened again, that means a regression typically means that you need to add a test to make sure that that you won't have this problem again without knowing it. Another thing you need to do at this point is all of those places that you researched where maybe you didn't find the right answer, you can add a comment there of what you found out. And that's not just to be nice to like the community of all the people that look at these things. It's for yourself. Like I find all of the time I end up back in the same place with a similar problem in the future. I don't remember what the solution was. I don't remember like the answer to something that happened last year. But I go through the same process. I end up at the same page and I see what I put there, and then I don't have to, solve the whole problem again. So in order to solve a problem responsibly, you should never have the problem again, right? That's the goal, to have less and less bugs so you never see the same one again. So there's a couple of different ways that I'll do that. One is obviously like an open source contribution. So if you can patch something, you can send a patch up to the module. If it's not something that's going to get fixed in a module like that, I have a distribution that we use. It's called Bear, and that's just like our own sort of starting point distribution. And we fix a lot of things in the distribution. So if there's like an issue of, say, when they double click submit and they get 2 nodes, okay, well, I can fix that in the distribution, right? So then none of our sites will have that problem again. Or I can say, our site builder forgot to turn caching on all the views again. I can fix that in the distribution by making it default when you add a new view that it has caching on, right? So then you won't have to deal with these issues again. So even after you've fixed it responsibly, you still have to ship the solution, which means if you have a live site, you have to get somebody to peer review your solution, test your solution, say it's okay, perhaps have the client look at it, confirm that it fixed it for them on dev, and then finally send it up to production. So you have to kind of like, when somebody says like, oh, that's just a little problem, I can fix it in 5 minutes, it's not really 5 minutes at all. There's a lot of process surrounding any type of work like this in order to like responsibly deploy it and not break a site. And then my favorite part is billing, and I think billing doesn't just mean like making money. To me, it means like remembering the job part of the job. So I used to like be like a kind of like a bug fixing fairy where I would just kind of go around and, oh, there's a problem, I'll fix that. Then I realized like nobody cares, like nobody knows that I'm going around fixing everything on their site. They didn't know that it needed fixing or that they had broken it in the first place, right? So, but I used to think, well, what's the point in talking to them about it? They don't know anything about it. And it's just gonna take 10 times longer if we have to have all these conversations about it. And I realized that's the job part of the job. If you don't talk to people about the situation, they won't appreciate that you did anything. Okay, so a lot of people talk about that Drupal runs on the LAMP stack, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. But I think in terms of problem solving, we actually have a bigger stack than that. And so one of the big things that you need to figure out when you're scoping a problem is which part of the stack does the problem occur on, and making sure that you are solving the problem on the level that it occurs. For example, you'll see a lot of times people will try to fix a Drupal problem with CSS. Like they'll try to be like, oh, I didn't want it to say add comment, I'll just put display none for those links, right? Well, that's not the level of the problem, right? The level of the problem is the Drupal configuration, but you decided to solve the problem in CSS. Well, now you have 2 problems because now you're going, wait, how come I can't see the add comment links anymore? And how come people can still add comments if they like know this path? And now I'm getting comments that are showing up, and people don't know how to add them, and I can't figure out how to get my links back. Who got rid of them? So that doesn't help the problem when you do things on the wrong layer. So the layers that I have listed here, there's Linux, which is it doesn't have to be Linux, right? You can run Drupal on any operating system. But your operating system, the types of problems that you get there are usually just like your file permissions are misconfigured. Anytime you have a problem that seems related to files, you want to go to that media configuration page, and it'll tell you like if your files are unwritable, because that can cause a lot of different problems. But you don't really usually get a lot of problems like on the operating system level. Apache or any other web server that you're running it on, you don't usually get a lot of problems on the Apache level. MySQL, sometimes you can get database problems, like database tables can lock up. Maybe your database, you can't import it. But it's relatively few of your like Drupal problems are really like on the database level. Then on the PHP level, you've got your Drupal code, and that has like levels inside of itself. So you have your core bugs, contrib problems, stuff from your custom code, and then just bad configuration, right? So you have to look at when a lot of times I would say when a problem is reported, configuration is really common for that to be the problem. Like it's just, oh, they have the wrong permission. They have this one, but they didn't have this one. Custom code is often very buggy because it's brand new and it hasn't been used by a lot of people. Contrib code is often very buggy, especially if you don't have a lot of experience with the modules that you're picking. And core actually has problems, but it happens less. HTML, typically a problem that you'll have on the HTML layer will be because somebody entered in content with like broken HTML tags, and the way that that'll look is like that the page is all like everything's italic from all the way down the page, or like the sidebar's in the wrong place, but only on this one page. If it's only on one page, that's probably because of the content there. The other thing that you can have go wrong with your HTML is that you added a new template and you didn't match up the opening and closing tags properly, which will happen if you're not obsessive about the spacing that you use in files. So just you want to be really careful with that, and you can also kind of not have those kinds of HTML problems if you use they're like different like HTML fixer like formats and things like that. CSS, a lot of times CSS problems manifest as you only have the problem in IE7, right? So when you only have the problem in IE7, that usually means it's a CSS problem or it's a JavaScript problem. You can, with CSS sometimes, you can, if you change the theme and you have different CSS, then you can see where that's coming from. You definitely want to like turn off CSS aggregation so you can easier find what's going on in your CSS and what's coming from which file to debug that. JavaScript problems, a lot of times you'll see an error in the console. If you have a JavaScript problem, you can be sure you have a JavaScript problem because you can just turn off JavaScript and then you don't have the problem. Browse, you can actually have problems that are really like the browser. So for example, like not just like that it's not compatible with good CSS or JavaScript like IE, but I had a client say, we can't see the images on the sidebar, and it was like, well, yeah, because it turned out that they have an ad blocker in their browser that thought that those were ads. Well, that's not really on any level here other than like their particular browser and how they had it configured. So you'll have to deal with problems like that that are just like seem way out of the league of like the normal stack. And then pebkeg is problem exists between keyboard and chair. And that's a frequent area of problems to debug. Okay, so the takeaways in general, write down everything. That's, I think, the biggest step forward that you can make, whether you want to do it on a piece of paper or in the ticket of your ticketing system, or just like in Notepad or whatever, like keep notes. Be really careful that you can reproduce your experiments, even if that means running them twice, getting somebody else to run them. Just make sure that you don't have bad assumptions. Watch out for rabbit holes, because a rabbit hole means that you start to follow something too obsessively, and you lose all track of time and all track of how important this experiment is. And sometimes people, when they're going down rabbit holes, all of a sudden you ask them what they're working on, they're like, well, I started out trying to debug this, but then I started debugging this other thing, and then I found this thing, and then I was over here, and now I'm debugging this, and now I think I just broke everything. So I feel like I'm just debugging the stuff that I broke. You're like, you're out of control. I mean, this is not moving it forward at all, right? If you find another problem while you're solving one problem, write that one down on a separate piece of paper. Put it in another ticket to look at later. But unless it's like absolutely related and is two parts of the same problem, put it aside and don't let it distract you. Make sure you're isolating your issues instead of letting them get tangled up. And you have to discipline yourself to take breaks. So most of us have like some level of OCD and some level of pride with solving problems, and it's hard to walk away. But actually that is what makes you be really good at it, is if you have the self-discipline to be able to take breaks, to be able to talk to other people about it, and ideally to sleep on it. If the problem doesn't have to be solved today, instead of spending 3 hours debugging it today, spend a half an hour, sleep on it, fix it in the morning in 15 minutes. Now you only charged your client 45 minutes instead of 3 hours. Most of the time, if you sleep on a problem, you'll come to a solution much faster. Like just like if you do crossword puzzles or anything like that, you look at the crossword puzzle, then you look at it the next morning, all of a sudden you know all the answers, right? It's much faster than sitting there and like going through it a million times. And also when you talk to someone about what the problem is, they don't have to be an expert for that to be worthwhile. As long as they will pretend to know what you're talking about, like you can just explain that. You see it all the time when somebody says, hey, can you look at my computer real quick? You come over and they go, yeah, I just don't understand. Oh, I see it. Yep. Right? They see it as soon as they try to tell it to you. Because they've changed, because it changes their mode of thinking, and then all of a sudden they're trying to say it from a different perspective to you, and that just helps a lot. So the best way to solve problems, obviously, is to not have them in the first place. So these are a few ways to kind of have fewer problems. So one thing that I'm really a big fan of is peer review. So we have a policy where everything that you do has to be peer reviewed. So everything happens in a ticket. The ticket could be complicated, like develop this new module that integrates with blah, blah, blah. Or it could be add a new field to the content type. It doesn't matter how simple it is, it has to get reviewed. And the person who's reviewing it has to, it's similar to how issues are reviewed on Drupal.org, where you have to look at all the code that was committed, test test what they did, look at what the goal was, send it back if anything was wrong. And also when we review it, we make sure that they were responsible in their solution. So if they found a fix to a module, did they post a patch for that module? And did they post the patch the right way? And did they keep a copy of the patch? And did they name the patch consistently? So there's all of this process for how to make sure that we don't, it's not just did you solve the problem, it's also how have you made sure that we won't have this problem again. Automated testing obviously is a great way to have less bugs. The automated testing that we do is not with simple test, but with something called Behat, which is more like sort of similar to Selenium testing, where it's like browser-based and it's happening on like the actual site that you're working on instead of just some abstract blank site. Zero tolerance is kind of my policy with bugs. I always think it's weird when people say, "Oh yeah, ignore that. I'm giving you a demo, but just ignore that problem. Oh, and there's there's a message over there. Just ignore that." Because we're gonna have like a day where we're gonna fix all the bugs. We're lining them all up, and then we're gonna fix them. I mean, is that what you do in your house? Like, are you just like, "Oh, I have one roach in the kitchen, but don't worry about that." Like, no, there's one there, and there's one over there. After I get like 20, then I'm just gonna take them all out. The problem is they start to interact, right? They start to breed. You don't want them. You don't want like multiple bugs. It's harder to fix a site that has multiple things broken because it makes it more confusing. Log gardening. That's just that I always click around to the watchdog logs and the status log, and even when there's nothing wrong, just when I'm just doing my work, and try to, if there's anything in the log and it's like notice blah blah blah, go fix those little things. If you fix the little things, it'll make the logs cleaner. It'll kind of just, to me, I feel like this stuff is actually hard. That's the reason that we have all these conferences and we're always reading, and it only is mostly like smart people working on it, and we're all trying to learn it. It's actually very difficult. And when you're doing something difficult and complicated, you want to do that in a very controlled, pristine, like clean environment, right? You're not going to just like do a surgery on like your dirty desk. So I like to keep the logs very clean and have just as clean a surface as possible. Not because I'm like a great clean person in like my normal life, but because I'm doing complicated surgery here, and it's going to make it a lot harder if there are lots of like little other things going wrong. Using version control like Git really can help you to deal with problems because you can see what has changed. It's really impossible to deal with new problems if somebody's just like hacking files with FTP and you have no idea what they might have done, right? A lot of times problems are new and you can see like what's new and you can revert those changes and then try it that way. And the other good thing about Git is when you're debugging the problem, I like to kind of like make a little bit of a mess, and I put like all kinds of like debug backtraces and DPM this and print this, and then I just do git checkout and clean up the whole mess, right? So you don't have to like worry about the mess you're making while you're debugging. The other thing that I do is I have consistent environments. So like my local server is a virtual machine that's exactly the same as the production servers. So I don't have to wonder, I don't have to have all of these issues where it's like, and the dev server is also the same as the production server, so you don't have to go, wait a minute, why did it work here, now it doesn't work there, right? And you want to be developing throughout the project on as close as possible to what the live environment is going to be. So you don't have to go through this whole thing of surprises the day of launch where things are different on that server. And practicing safe contrib, that means not being so gung-ho about downloading all these modules that you don't know about. So when I was kind of newer to Drupal, I used to think that people were some of the older Drupal people were so conservative about the modules that they used. And I just thought, man, you guys are just like behind the times. Like, you don't even know about all these cool modules, and you're just only using like the same old ones. But as you get more experienced, you also become more conservative with the modules, because having a lot of contrib modules that are relatively newer modules, or not a lot of people are using them, or you've never used them before this project, is a really good way to end up with a lot of problems, right? So it's always better to have less features on the project that you're working on than to make it more complicated but like have problems. So I'll show you in just like a couple minutes a problem that I'm working on. If I can mirror my screen, just as an example of real life. And then I'll do questions. How do I mirror you? Okay. So this is like my ticketing system. I don't necessarily recommend it. Okay, so this is the problem that is reported here. PTO, meaning is paid time off, content from private groups in search results. Okay, restricted content from private groups is appearing in global site search. We actually have a sort of like a ticket, like what you're supposed to include in a ticket. So this is the project manager put this in here. They put an example URL. So the project manager at this point has already like had some conversations and some emails and like figured this much out, right? And he gave me an hour and a half to look into it, right? So I don't know if we can read this. Okay. So since it was a problem with private content, the first thing I checked was whether you could actually access that content or if it was just showing up in the search results. Because is this a search problem or is this an access control problem, right? So the first thing I did was I ruled out that it was an access control problem. And I came up with a few experiments that I wanted to explore. So one was, maybe this is caused by views caching. Maybe this only happened on this one URL, not like all of them, right? Because they only gave us like one example. I said there was another bug related to search that I had just fixed but hadn't been deployed yet. Maybe it's related to that. Maybe there's a problem in the configuration of search that I should just check. And then finally, if none of those work, I'm going to have to go in there and debug what's going on with node access, right? So the first thing I ruled out that was very quick was cache. So I made a point to write that so that nobody would have to try that again or think about that again, right? So I cleared the cache, the same exact thing happened. So then I switched to a local index and re-indexed, and I got the same problem that ruled out the Acquia effect, because that's where it was hosted. It ruled out any need to re-index, and it ruled out any interaction with that other bug. So I took the time to like think about the result of the experiment and what that actually ruled out and where that actually left me, right, before I started the next experiment. Here I just made a note that I happened to find two other problems while I was doing this, and that I fixed those. I just made a note of that because I won't remember that, and maybe that won't matter, but maybe next week they're going to have a conference call and they're going to say, you know, we had a report from last week that this one node had a fatal error, but we can't see it anymore. So maybe you guys should look into it. Well, now I can say, oh no, I actually did see that. That was 3 days ago because I wrote it down. That's why you don't see it anymore, because it's fixed. Because if I don't write it down, I'll forget all about it. I won't remember if I actually fixed it or if I just saw it. You know, I don't have a great memory. Now here is a really important part. So in comment 5, I say, wait a minute, I found out comment 3 was completely incorrect, right? Because the problem was originally that this Cindy S PTO thing was accessible when it shouldn't be. Then I realized there were like 5 different nodes called Cindy S PTO, and I'm getting them all mixed up with each other, and I'm thinking that like I'm getting different results than I actually am, and the only way I can do this right is to look at the node IDs and not the path aliases, because they all look almost the same. So I had to go back. This time I kept track of what the node ID was. I had to go back and kind of test everything again now that I was being more careful, that I realized that things were getting mixed up. Then I confirmed that that reindexing and running it locally actually did fix it. So that left 3 possibilities are left now of things I need to experiment with. But at this point, I had already been doing this for an hour and a half because I lost a lot of time trying to reindex it all. So it's time to stop. And I think, so I've just wrapped it up with like a few observations of what I think the next steps could be, what the options are now to tell the client after putting in this hour and a half. And I also noticed that there's a usability problem because a lot of the Cindy S PTO nodes were actually set to public when they should be private. So maybe this field should be defaulting to private. So there's actually, you know, there seems to be an access search issue, but there's also a usability issue to discuss coming up with a solution for that as well. So the reason that, and you see at the end here, it's not fixed yet, right? It's back to the client to decide if they want to put more time in it. The reason that I showed this one as an example is I think it's really important to see that a really successful problem solving does not necessarily mean that you solve the problem, right? Like, I didn't solve the problem, but I kept a lot of notes, I learned a lot, and I didn't blow up the budget, right? So I think that's actually a huge success. A lot of people, it's going to say like 6 hours, and there won't be any notes, right? It'll just say, oh, I spent 6 hours on it, I couldn't figure it out. Okay, well, what did you rule out? What happened in those 6 hours? Like, do I have to start at the beginning now? Because you can't even tell me if, like, you could reproduce that when you weren't logged in, or if caching had any effect. You can't tell me anything, but you spent 6 hours on it, which now we can't even bill for because they didn't approve that. And, you know, even if you did solve the problem at the end of those 6 hours, if you can't bill the time, you've just lost us a bunch of money, right? And maybe they really didn't even care about the problem. And maybe you never even found the usability part, which is a bigger deal ultimately, because most of their content is still going to be public if they keep on posting it publicly, right? So like the fact that there's a bug is actually like less of a problem than the fact that there's this usability problem. So that's it. Any questions? Okay. Well, have a good camp. Thanks.